to welcome you all here today. My name is, again, Jim Ryan. I'm the Director of Research and the Director of the Middle East Program here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And it's a pleasure to be with you all here today for the third webinar we've had since the outbreak of renewed conflict in Israel and in Gaza on October 7th. As I'm sure all of you are aware, on October 7th, the organization that runs the Gaza Strip, Hamas, launched a surprise attack into southern Israel, taking hundreds of hostages and over 1,000 lives in the process. In response, since then, we have seen an ongoing and aggressive bombing campaign of Gaza by the Israeli Defense Forces, and response series of rockets from Hamas into Israel. And we are still at this point waiting to see if there will be a ground incursion into Gaza by the Israeli Defense Forces. In our previous webinars on this subject, we've looked at first the initial read and react analysis to the attack and the initial response. That was a week and a half ago with our senior fellows Joshua Krasna and Lior Sternfeld. Last week, we were joined by Sean Yom and Brandon Friedman to talk about the regional response among Arab partner states to the conflict. And today we're going to be joined by a group of our fellows to discuss the global impacts of this conflict and where major players around the world are positioning themselves, and what kinds of issues do we foresee arising as the conflict unfolds in terms of geopolitics. So we're very happy to have with us today Michael Walsh, who is a senior fellow in our Africa program, Michael Beckley, who is the director of our Asia program, and we hope later to have Leon Hadar, who is a senior fellow with us in the Middle East program, to particular discuss the EU's position on the conflict and what kind of developments we may see in the near future there. How this is going to work, like our previous webinars, we're going to try to keep things fairly conversational. I have a few questions to deliver here, and at any time folks can enter a question into the Q&A box, and we'll get to those in about 30 or so minutes. And also, before we get started, I also want to sincerely thank those of you who've joined us here who are supporters of FPRI, in one form or another, whether you are a member with us, a board member, a trustee. We could not do this work without your support, and these things, as a colleague of mine, Jacques Delille, is fond of saying, these things are free to you, but not free to us. So we really enjoy and appreciate that support. So I'd like to get started with each of our panelists. So we're going to start with Michael Walsh, because unfortunately he's going to have to leave us a bit into this program because he has an emergency appointment that's come up. But Michael, I want to starting with you. I would love to know a bit first about how you read how these events have been received in Africa among major African governments. You have a piece that's just gone live today, minutes ago, actually, on an FPRI about the reception of these events in South Africa. You might address that real briefly, but this is really a global event in many ways. So please walk us through, what this means for African policy writ large, and for any of the major actors that you think are important.
Yeah, I think in trying to make sense of this, we have to look at how it's being framed globally. So there's three major concepts that are sort of at stake in all these conversations we're having in response to the Hamas attacks on the 7th. The first framing is obviously around whether or not the attack counts as a terrorist attack. That's the debate between legitimate resistance versus terrorism. And obviously the United States and many other countries have taken the stance that this is definitely a incidence of international terrorism and should be treated as an incident of international terrorism. And that's a very important concept to pay attention to. Another concept that's really important in this discussion is the concept of apartheid. And many states around the world consider Israel to be an apartheid state. This is a long-standing narrative that's been out there. And many people, in trying to make sense of the incidents and really about the response and the siege of Gaza and everything that's followed, are emphasizing the apartheid nature of South Africa. And then the third sort of major conceptualization that's being discussed is ethnic cleansing. And so that's something that's being emphasized by states who are looking at the siege of Gaza and then the forthcoming invasion of Gaza that everyone's expecting, and that they're emphasizing that. And so these are not mutually exclusive concepts. These concepts have to exist within a world of narrative. And so some people are, very readily able to admit that this was a terrorist attack, but at the same time want to also emphasize the root causes of why it's happening. They might make the argument that this is also, one of the root causes is the apartheid nature of Israel. And they might say that, in the future, we're facing the risk of ethnic cleansing. And so they're not mutually exclusive concepts, but how you emphasize them and which ones you choose to use and where you draw these lines matters in the world of international diplomacy. And the U.S. has taken a very clear stand on where the U.S. emphasized, especially in the first, 72 hours after the incident. It was very focused on Hamas being a terrorist organization, Israel having a right to respond, and that's the narrative that started. When you look at the African response, we have two other concepts that really matter. In the U.S., we kind of divide the world of Africa into two separate regions. There's North Africa, which falls under the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs within the State Department, and there's Sub-Saharan Africa. And so this division is actually quite useful when we're thinking about how Africa is responding to this incident. When we talk about what exists in North Africa, it's the Morocco, it's the Algeria, it's the Tunisia, it's Egypt, it's the Libya. And I know Egypt's a special case, and I'm going to leave that to one of my follow-up presenters. But when you look at Algeria is one of the most important countries in all of this. I mean, the U.S. has invested heavily in trying to improve relations with Algeria under this administration. And this incident, drove a huge wedge in that process. Morocco is another country that's really a challenge. I mean, Morocco was one of the three countries that moved forward with trying to normalize the relations with Israel and trying to move forward on that. Obviously, there's a gap between what parts of the population would like the government of Morocco to say about what's happening right now in the Israel-Palestine situation versus what the government of Morocco is saying. In sub-Saharan Africa, I think really the most interesting case is South Africa. And even since I wrote that piece last, I think a Wednesday or Thursday, so much has changed. I mean, with what's happening in the background. So things are quickly moving. Countries' narratives are moving. They're changing. In South Africa, there's been an emphasis on root causes. I mean, this goes back to what happened with the Russian arms situation with Ukraine. And that was a huge incident back in the spring that led to a breakdown in relations between the U.S. and South Africa. At the time, there was a lot of emphasis, and there has been a lot of emphasis since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in South Africa on what's the root cause of why it's happening. They want to focus on root causes in their discussion. And they have, made the point that had to do with NATO's eastward expansion. And they emphasize that. I mean, we're seeing, again, in this incident, a focus on root causes again as well. And, the initial response by South Africa was very much, we stand with Palestine. And the root cause of what's happening in this region is the apartheid nature of South Africa. And as a liberation party, and as a party that fought against this, and really a country that has identified Israel as being an apartheid state for as far back as the apartheid era in South Africa, even the apartheid governments looked at it that way. I think that you have a historical nature of this discussion and how it's being framed by South Africa. And there's a political reality of why it needs to be framed that way as well with the upcoming elections next year, and trying to reassert the fact that the ANC and South African politicians stand on the right side of what they view as justice. And so, this is getting wrapped up into many different layers on the domestic and the international. But I would say, to summarize, when you look at Africa as a whole and how Africa is responding, there is no African response. I mean, there was a great map that was created that showed how different countries reacted. It was by a French outlet in this, I think it was 42 hours after the event happened. And when you look at that map, there's different colors. It's a very interesting map because it shows, which countries came out strongly in support of Israel, which countries came out strongly in support of the Palestinian people. And then you had to look at the countries that, didn't really try to take a stand at all initially on this and try to avoid this and the political fallout from it. But one part of that map that I think is really interesting, it was also pointed out which countries actually have diplomatic relations with Israel in Africa. because not everyone does. And then the other point of it is that, the nature of the diplomatic relations. I mean, South Africa downgraded their relations with Israel over this debate over, the settlers and the issues that they have in the West Bank and with Gaza. And so all of that history, and I think that's what I'll leave with, is really relevant in this conversation. You hear over and over again in the global discourse, a debate over when did this start? I heard on Al Jazeera the other day, one of the Hamas representatives yelling back at the reporter saying, you say October 7th, but I'm asking you, when did this really start? This started far before October 7th. Where you choose to start this conversation and to emphasize for the response and, what's legitimate, what's not, and then also in the future, are we talking about the short term or the long term? What are we trying to achieve as end states for both of these parties? And so different African countries, initially focused on different things in terms of international legal concepts, and they're focusing on different outcomes, and they're focusing on, different political realities, both in the domestic and the international, and they're motivated in different ways.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. I think, the important things to hit on there, because there have been conversations that we've been having in numerous webinars in our Africa program over the last couple of years, is that a smarter American foreign policy in Africa takes into account the history that that these countries have with America's global competitors, with Russia, with China, and in this case, for certain, in the case of South Africa, with Israel Palestine, this becomes really, really important. And likewise, the point Michael raised about elections, there's obviously we have elections coming up in the United States in the next year. And there's been a lot of talk about the way this conflict may play out in the context of a presidential campaign. The United States is not the only country that has elections in the next year, and in fact, this is quite likely to become an election issue in many places. So, I think those are two things well worth continuing with. Michael will stay on with us as long as we can, but if it's okay, I'm going to turn to Mike Beckley, but thank you so much for that insight, Mike. And I send people to the article he just published today on the response in South Africa.
And Jim, I'll just add one thing to your point about it being an election issue. It's also potentially a regime survival issue for some countries. And so, the stakes are really high for some countries, including countries that were moving forward trying to normalize relations with Israel prior to this happening. And so there's a lot of dynamics at play here. And one thing we're not doing in this webinar, which would be interesting to talk about in the future, is the African diaspora element in all of this in the United States, because we talk a lot about the Arab diaspora engaging on this issue, but the African diaspora engages on this issue quite actively as well, and it's an important thing to take into consideration.
No, absolutely. That's a good point. It is something we should follow up with in a later discussion. Mike Beckley, I want to turn to you, and really important in all of this has been, China is having a greater role in Middle Eastern politics, sort of writ large. A big story from earlier this year was the role of Beijing in brokering, a tentative agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia to normalize their diplomatic relations. Of course, Israeli normalization with Saudi Arabia was the sort of precursor story, and has gotten wrapped up into the events since October 7th. From your vantage point, what can you tell us about how China's position in the Middle East, which they've had long relations with Israel as well as several other regional actors. What about China's position in the Middle East do you think has changed, or what can you tell us about that position since October 7th?
Well, I think China's pursuing two main interests specifically regarding the Israel-Hamas clash. I think first is to try to pose as pro-Palestinian as a way to sort of woo other Arab states, and China cares about its relationships with those Arab states largely because China needs lots of oil and resources and ports and maybe even a military base, including the one that seems to be currently being constructed in the UAE. And so from China's perspective, making sure that you have a good relationship is important to lock those resources down. It's also critical to split countries like Saudi Arabia from the United States to encourage what the Chinese and the Russians and a bunch of other countries call a multipolar world, one that is not going to be Western and US dominated. And China has to, China's actual interests on the ground between Israel and Hamas, I think, are rather slight, but it's important for China to come out with these bland diplomatic statements and to pose as an ally of the Palestinians, because keep in mind, China is in the midst of a brutal crackdown on Muslims in its own territory, with the Uyghurs that have been herded into concentration camps and forced sterilization of Uyghur women, et cetera. And so for China, you need to make sure that that does not destroy your credibility with Arab Muslim states. And I think China has been largely successful in doing that. Even Mahmoud Abbas, gave this statement saying that, we understand that China, the Uyghurs, they don't really count as part of this broader Muslim community. They're this sort of fringe movement, and China gave Mahmoud Abbas a bunch of aid in return for that. So I think China in drawing and trying to cater to Arab states also obviously draws on a long-standing anti-imperialist message that it's always cultivated ever since the founding of the PRC. This really emerges out of its communist heritage. People say, is China really communist anymore? And I think if you're talking about the sort of dogma that all forms of capitalism are wage slavery, then obviously China has opened up some space for markets and private firms, although increasingly less in recent years. But the other aspects of communism seem alive and well to me. Part of it is the institutional structure, the Leninist organization that obviously has been greatly strengthened, but also this part of Marxism is anti-imperialism. That is a key tenet of Marxism that the PRC has always promoted, this idea that there are haves and have-nots in the world. And just like Mao Zedong tried to portray China as really the leader of this of poor countries around the world, I think Xi Jinping has been playing on that increasingly, especially since coming to power, but certainly since the pandemic too, trying to portray China as sort of a champion of what we bizarrely refer to as the global South, but basically of poor countries around the world that, in his telling, have been left out by a Western-dominated world. So I think this is all part of the messaging on China's behalf. Part of it is motivated by resources, but also just cultivating this broader ideological movement against the West. And then the second major interest here is obviously China's relationship with Iran. So there's a key geopolitical angle to be aware of. Iran supports Hamas and China supports Iran. And I think China supports Iran because they view them as part of this axis of autocrats, including Russia, North Korea. And obviously this is a very motley crew. They're not tight allies by any sense, but they are increasingly looking like a bloc that is working together. And I think it's because they share a basic common interest. They each want to dominate their respective region to a greater extent than they currently do. They don't like the way the borders are drawn. They don't like the fact that the American military is highly present in their region. And they view the United States as the main thing standing in their way, not just militarily, but obviously the United States has used sanctions against Iran. It's used it against Russia and has used it to a limited degree against China. And so this idea that even though we're not exactly the same type of country, we all need to band together for our own self-protection and strategic profit, and this sort of enemy of my enemy dynamic, I think, has really driven these countries increasingly together. And so when China looks at this situation between Israel and Hamas, it's also thinking in broader geopolitical terms. And if you just look at Russia, China, and Iran, I mean, from my perspective, all of these nations are driven by these sort of ideologies of discontent. I mean, it seems like when you really listen to what the leaders of these countries are saying, it really sounds like they view themselves as the inheritors of these grand imperial legacies, that their nations used to have these golden eras that have been ripped away, and that the national rejuvenation that they seek is blocked by the United States and its allies. And the fact that they just seem to not really like the fact that they still live in a Western dominated world, that they have to trade in dollars, and that exposes them to potential sanctions, that when they look at their technology, big chunks of those components are produced in the West, and they can't fully control those technologies, the borders that were drawn, the institutions that prevail, even something as simple as having to speak English or listen to English at international conferences seems to really irk them. And so there just seems like there's tremendous resentment among those major nations. And so when Hamas attacks Israel with Iran's blessing and long-standing support, China is mindful of that connection. And China certainly has to worry that if this conflict escalates, like Hezbollah comes in and then Iran maybe comes in, that's obviously going to threaten China's economic interests in the broader Middle East. But at the same time, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world from a geopolitical perspective for China, because a wider conflict that bogs the United States down. The United States already had to send 2 aircraft carriers to the Mediterranean, is going to just reduce the amount of military hardware and strategic attention that the United States has to try to get tough with Beijing, and that allows Beijing to move ahead with everything that they're doing, blasting Filipino fishing boats with water cannons and menacing Taiwan with shows of force, etc. So overall, China's interests are limited, but I think there are key economic interests, key geopolitical interests, and then this broader ideological conflict that Xi Jinping seems to think his nation has with.
Thanks, Mike. That's a really helpful heuristic for seeing China's approach to this conflict. I think we could probably get back, after I turn to Leon here, and I want to talk a little bit more about this balancing act, right? Because it's really, there are misalignments within that block that I think are going to be really important for how things develop down the line. But Leon, thank you for getting on. I'm sorry if there was a technical issue earlier, but turning to you. You wrote a really interesting piece for us earlier in the summer about the EU's new approach to the Middle East, and of course, we have seen a number of different reactions. Actually, there's very strong unity across Europe and the United States, the Euro-Atlantic, in the wake of this conflict. But I really specifically want to ask about the EU. I mean, because countries like France and Germany and Britain have different interests and different strategies for dealing with this region. How do you read initial responses from Europe, and how is the view from Europe maybe a little bit different than the view from the United States in this conflict since it's happened?
Well, I think we can go back to Emmanuel Macron talking about strategic independence, about this notion of the EU becoming a great power. And this is really a time when great powers have an influence, when we have this kind of geopolitical wars and so on. And it seems to me that overall, one can argue that the EU ain't a big power, if you want to put it in simple terms. Actually, the economists put it very good. It said, back to cacophony. The EU is returning to the same kind of splits that it has between its various members. It doesn't have a common foreign policy. It doesn't have a common national security policy. The only reason it succeeded in mobilizing some of its military and diplomatic resources during the Ukraine war because of the United States. If they were left on their own, all of this wouldn't have happened. So as far as the Middle East, it's actually interesting. It started with the EU announcing that they are stopping their economic development aid to the Palestinians immediately after the attacks, which didn't make a lot of sense because the EU is the only entity that actually gives economic development aid to the Palestinians. So they changed that immediately. And then Ursula von der Leyen, who is the boss of the Commission, went to Israel and sounded almost like Biden, saying that the EU is identifying with the Israeli concerns and so on and so forth. Of course, after she said that, immediately there were major reactions from the capital of the European Union, countries saying, what are you talking about? What about the Palestinians? What about the aid to the Palestinians? We are really not so, identified with the Israeli position. So as a result of all of that, what you add at the end is that each nation state is operating on its own. Germany, traditionally, because of World War II and other reasons, is the most pro-Israeli country in the EU, and the German chancellor indeed visited Israel and expressed his support. Great Britain is led by a conservative government that is very sympathetic to the Israeli position. The British Prime Minister went to Israel and again sounded very much like Biden. And at that point, you could see already the changes taking place. One of the interesting countries is France. France is has the largest number of Jewish population in Europe and also the largest number of Arabs in Europe. So there is, a certain polarization here. And the last thing that the French need, and you already had some signs of that, is a political convulsion that will result from, some debate over the Arab-Israeli issue. So I think Macron was playing it, kind of low-key, supporting Israel, but at the same time saying some nice things about the need to provide aid to the Palestinians. He is coming to Israel. He and the Dutch prime minister are arriving to Israel, I think, this week. But overall, I don't see really any effort on the part of the European to come up with any, common unified position on that. Now, despite all of that, I would argue that now that we are talking about the post-war scenarios, and everyone is asking what's going to be at the end, is it going to be Israeli forces? The PA is going to return, maybe a multinational Arab force. My argument would be this is an excellent opportunity for the European to project their power in the Middle East. Why not send a European peacekeeping forces to the Gaza Strip? This is an opportunity for them to show that, they put their money where the mouth is and are active, have a certain activist policy in the Middle East. So, as I said, on one hand, I'm very pessimistic about the European emerging as a major player in all of that. But at the same time, I think it's the interest of the United States. And by the way, if you remember, after Biden gave his speech, Great Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, Italy also, the Italian prime minister is also visiting Israel. All of them came out with statements supporting the United States position on this issue. So this is an opportunity really for the European to show that they can do something in the Middle East. I'm not holding my breath about that, but at least I'm looking forward for something to happen.
Thank you for that. And that's constant in many ways with the piece that you wrote for us earlier, and of course, the European Union playing a more activist role in the Middle East might sit well with some folks there, might not sit so well with other folks across the region, given the histories there as well. I think it's something, again, that's it's going to be important to balance. I have one or two more questions to put to our panel here, but I know we've got one or two in from the audience, and I want to get to those in about 10 minutes or so. Once again, just want to reiterate, if anyone, we have almost 100 people here in the audience, wants to pop a question into the Q&A box. I'll be checking that back in on that and reading those questions in just a bit. So one question I wanted to ask really to the both of you was that, 2 years ago when we had the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, I mean, the reaction in the American foreign policy space and in the global foreign policy space really seemed to indicate that this was a kind of world ordering event in so many ways, especially if you go back to the national security strategy that was released almost exactly a year ago today. The theme throughout all of that was sort of reorienting American foreign policy around rebuffing Putin's invasion and countering Russian and Chinese power across the world. We saw very recently in Biden's most recent address to the American public that he would like to see further aid for Ukraine tied to aid for Israel in this ongoing conflict. What do either of you see as the opportunities and pitfalls of that approach? Do we see this conflict having similar kinds of ordering effects within the policy community, within the American foreign policy priorities, and where do we see the ripple out to China policy, to EU policy, to global policy? Whichever of you wants to take that first. I leave it to both of you.
I've been talking about globalization of the Gaza war, and in some respect, you saw it last Wednesday when Biden was landing in Israel to express his support for Israel and so on and so forth. At the same time, almost, the Russian President Vladimir Putin was landing in Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping. Both of them expressed support for Hamas, and not strong support, but they certainly didn't express support for Israel. And this was, by the way, taking place against the backdrop of the blast in the hospital in Gaza, which the Russian foreign minister immediately called a crime, and the Chinese foreign minister talked about collective punishment. And both of them have blamed the United States for what's happening, because their argument is that the United States has not done enough to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and sided with Israel. Both of them also have strengthened their ties with Iran in recent years for various reasons. But, you know, to put it in a big perspective, what you asked, from a geostrategic perspective, the goal of the Iranians, if we assume that they were, you know, puppet master, the mastermind, whatever behind that, was to sabotage the Israeli normalization of the relationship with Israel. There was a sense that we are on the eve of the establishment of an Arab-Sunni Israeli axis, pro-American axis, that will contain Iran and its proxies. That would have been a triumph for the United States. And the Hamas attack sabotaged that, torpedoed that, and as a result, in many ways advanced the interest of Iran, and by extension of the Russians and the Chinese, who are not interested in seeing the United States emerging as a winner in the Middle East. I would, however, you know, there is a tendency I noticed in Washington now to come up with this grand narrative, you know, because we were talking about, you know, there is one, there's one bloc of Democrats. Democrat is led by the US and the EU, and then China and Russia, the authoritarian regime, and so on. Now, the notion is that in some respect, this is part of the process, and that the Russian and the Chinese are actually interested in bringing Iran into their camp. You know, China indeed invited Iran to the BRICS, to join the BRICS, which is an and, you know, there's some economic relationship with it. And there's also a lot of talk that, you know, the Russian and Chinese, as one of your colleagues mentioned, are trying to exploit here and get sympathy in the global South. You know, the invitation to the BRIC is one example. But my argument would be that this is really too simplistic. Even when you talk about the global South, who is the symbol of the global South? India. And India is a strategic partner of the United States and a strategic friend of Israel. Global South, the Arab Sunni nation of Saudi Arabia are part of the global South, and they support the United States. So the notion that we are seeing here, this, you know, two blocks emerging, and, you know, I think the interest of China and Russia are opportunistic in nature. It is to, you know, weaken the United States and gain some advantage over the Americans. But remember, the Russians have good relationship with Israel. Israel actually refused to join the pro-Ukrainian camp because of that. China has technological economic ties with Israel. So I doubt very much that the Chinese are interested to see, you know, a new third world war, or even to turn this into part of, you know, the geostrategic struggle here. So, you know, it is part of the geostrategic changes, but I don't think it's a major event that is going to change everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that, Leon. Mike, turning to you, I mean, how do you see the impacts here on world order? I mean, are we going to look back on this event 6 months, a year from now, and say plus ça change, nothing's really changed, or are we going to be looking back, at a set of priorities that have really, shifted the way, nations around the world relate to both, the United States and China?
Well, let's start by acknowledging there's a lot we don't know. I mean, Israel hasn't started the main phase of its invasion of Gaza, and we don't know how that might escalate or not into a broader regional war. But I think it's highly unlikely that this event will have the same galvanizing effect or the same transformative effects on the world order that Ukraine, at least potentially, has, for just a bunch of basic reasons. I mean, this does not, I know it captures headlines because, Israel, Palestine is such a hot button issue, but it doesn't involve a major power. The numbers of people we're talking about are much smaller in scale than the war in Ukraine. Russia's got a population over 100 million in Ukraine, 43 million. We're talking about Gaza, which is, the size of the Washington, two sides, if you double the Washington, D.C. metro area, that's what we're talking about. Ukraine and Russia are some of the world's largest producers of food and other vital commodities that the rest of the world depends on. The resource ramifications of a massive war between Israel and Hamas are essentially nil in terms of the international order. And also, the West itself is split on this conflict in a way that it is not on the Ukraine conflict. After Russia's invasion, I saw Ukrainian flags everywhere that I traveled in the West, not a lot of Russian flags flying around. But what I have seen, since Hamas's barbaric attack on Israeli civilians is a bunch of pro-Palestinian protests around, even here in the United States at universities, et cetera. People have chosen this moment to come out in favor of the Palestinians, which just shows the split in the political support, with people being highly supportive of Israel or people being so supportive of the Palestinians and so anti-Israel that even in the face of just absolutely horrific, brutal attacks, they choose that moment to espouse their pro-Palestinian loyalty. And so I think that just shows the deep-seated split within the West. And so there's just not a lot of prospect of this particular conflict becoming a world order defining conflict that galvanizes, fundamental changes and alliances that then lead to changes in world order. And, right after Russia invaded Ukraine, I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs where, I was sort of wondering whether the war in Ukraine was going to fulfill the same role that the Korean War played in the original Cold War, namely that things like NATO were basically just pieces of paper and really on the shelf until the Korean War galvanized the Western coalition to band together, to massively increase defense spending, and to really solidify what we now call the West. I don't see any prospect of that happening in the war between Israel and Hamas. Now, that said, I do think these conflicts, Ukraine on the one hand and Israel on the other, are linked in the sense that the instability in both regions threatens the broader order that the United States wants to maintain. And I do think there is some substance to the sort of grand narrative. It's not necessarily a democracy versus autocracy thing, but I do think what people pejoratively often just call the liberal order, there actually is substance behind that. It's just the basic idea that borders should be frozen. You shouldn't have big wars of conquest, that old traditional empires should be broken up, and that the pieces of those old empires, whether it's Ukraine or Taiwan or whatever, get integrated into an open trade order, and countries large and small can basically plug and play with that open order. I mean, this is like high school, geopolitics 101. This is the system that was put in place after World War II to first win the Cold War and then prevent World War III. That order, I think, has tremendous value, but with spiraling wars in both Europe and potentially the Middle East, it just makes it harder for the United States to sustain that order. It also drains potentially U.S. resources from the main threat to that order, namely China. It's just a lot harder to check China when you, the United States, have to send arms to Ukraine and you have to send aircraft carriers to the Mediterranean. It's a lot harder to win allies in, again, I hate this term, the global South, because like 90% of the world's people live in the Northern Hemisphere, but poor countries around the world, let's say in Latin America, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, when you have to support Israel certain places around there are going to say, well, you seem to be siding with the quote colonizers against the colonized, and it lends itself to narratives that put the United States as this aggressive imperialist power, so it makes it harder to win hearts and minds there. I think, so at the end of the day, I don't see this as an order-driven event, but I think instability in the Middle East obviously is not good for the broader interest the United States has in terms of upholding or trying to patch together a liberal order.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, perhaps the impact on order from this event is something that's not going to come from the top of that order down, but rather from the bottom up or the middle out in a certain sense. I mean, it really does depend, I think, first on whether or not this is a conflict that enlarges itself in one way or another, or draws in regional powers in one way or another. But also because it and this is kind of getting back to something I referenced earlier, it does make a lot of the relationships that were changing and newly finding themselves in the last couple of years, between the United States and Arab partners, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, between China and its Arab partners, and between Israel and its Abraham Accord countries and potentially Saudi Arabia. It makes all of that much less comfortable. And it puts a lot of pressure on those relationships going forward. And I do think is we've hit on this a little bit. Consideration that each of the major powers in the world right now have to contend with to some degree. I mean, the China may have interest in fostering an anti-imperialist bloc that includes such varied actors as the Iranian state, militias in Iraq, Hezbollah, Hamas, and all of those actors might muck up relations between Saudi and China at the end of the day, and that would be that could be a net loss in some senses. So again, I think these are all issues that if they're not world ordering, they're putting pressure on that order and really interested. Well, you say they're interesting, but also in really demanding kinds of ways. I want to turn to audience questions here for the time that we have left. There was one question, about how the current conflict has affected U.S. relations with Arab allies, especially given the at least up until this point, shrinking U.S. footprint in the region already. We addressed some of these questions in our webinar last week, and I hope the person who asked this question can go back and check that. But Leon, I want to throw this one to you. How have you seen American relations with the key Arab partners here impacted, especially over the last couple of days since Biden's visit and canceled meetings with the Jordanian delegation and their president and so forth?
Well, I think what we are seeing here is really important in a sense that there is the divergence here between the Arab street and the elites. I think the elites, and certainly in the Arab Sunni countries, were in the process of normalizing ties with Israel, leading to Saudi Arabia and so on. At the same time, the Arab street, because of the influence of the social media, television, and all these images that come from the Middle East, is having an effect on them. They can't dismiss it. Robert Kaplan has come up with a nice book arguing that, enlightened authoritarian regimes in the Middle East is a good idea because, it provides stability and so on. But it's a good idea as long as they are stable. And as we saw in the past, during the Arab Spring and so on, this is the kind of event that can turn the masses against the elites and by extension against its patron, the United States, because the US is allied with those elites.
Yeah, that's an important point. I think, I saw in the last couple of days, just to illustrate this point, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the dictator in Egypt, invited people out to a protest, a pro-Palestinian protest that was organized by the state, in central Egypt or central Cairo, and many of the people that came out to protest were opponents of Sisi and brought placards that were, at the same time pro-Palestinian and anti-Sisi. And I think you're seeing dynamics like this play out in many places across the Middle East. There was a question in the chat about how we read Turkey's position on this. There have been, and much has been made of pro-Hamas rallies in Istanbul and other places around Turkey. These are rallies, despite the fact that up until at least today, Erdogan and the AKP's statements have been, uniformly pro-Palestinian. The protests on the street have largely been organized by members of the Islamist opposition parties and by groups that, really the Turkish government has tried to distance themselves from of late. So there's a lot of domestic politics happening, that runs counter to the longer run foreign relations issues that these countries have had, both with Israel and the United States. And I think that's an important dynamic to keep watching. I will go to another question here. Since we're talking global and we've talked a little bit of history, there's a fun question in the chat, about if there's a past war or conflict, either in this region or in a region that we have, some expertise in, what would we, use as a way of analogically understanding what's happening now and where things might have gone or might go. I mean, a lot have been thrown out over the last couple of days. If you follow the discourse on this, in particular, trying to think of events that were, overwhelming military victories, let's say, but that were nonetheless very unpopular for the governments that enacted them. The Tet Offensive comes to mind. There are, of course, wars in Iraq. Within Israel, a lot, people's minds have gone back to the, October 1973 Yom Kippur War, which had immense, historical, immense ramifications for Israeli politics internally, and many are predicting that happening within Israel now. I might turn to Mike first. Is there, from your perspective, a conflict? You mentioned the Korean War already, but one that might fall more in line with understanding a certain aspect of what's happening now in this discussion we're having.
Well, I wouldn't pretend to be enough of an expert on this region to have good historical analogies, but one that has been thrown out is 9/11, just in the sense of this attack on civilians that seems designed to trigger an overreaction, which then bolsters the political case of the side that initiated the attack. I would actually point it to you, Jim, as to whether any of these analogies actually hold. I think the quest for analogies itself can sometimes be a misguided enterprise, but that's certainly one that I've heard thrown out there. I think about it, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, personally, on the 9/11 analogy, I think it's really, really limited. I mean, I think the one way in which it does, bear some similarity is that there's just a lot of fear and anger and emotion that seems to be driving a lot of the policy discussions in its wake. But I think the most important thing about that comparison are the differences. I mean, on September 11th, 2001, very, very few Americans could put Afghanistan on a map, knew what Al Qaeda was, didn't really understand anything about the threat that Americans didn't know they were facing. Whereas, we're talking about an Israeli-Palestinian conflict in which the complete opposite is true. I mean, you have, enemies on either side that know each other almost too well. This is another stage in a conflict that's been ongoing for at least 75 years. So I think that's a really, really important distinction to draw. Leon, I've sort of asked this question in a previous webinar of some of our other participants about the Yom Kippur similarity. Are there other maybe instances earlier in this conflict you think are really important for people to pay attention to? Yeah.
Well, actually, the Yom Kippur, the 73 war is interesting and depressing from that perspective, because at the end of the day, what happened in 1973 is that indeed Israel was attacked. There was a surprise attack, and there was a war, and Israel and Egypt and Syria fought. But at the end of all of this, through the U.S. and Henry Kissinger diplomacy and so on, the two sides were able actually to, in some respect, even to take advantage of the war. It was said that the Arabs gained the honor now in 73, and now Israel saw the price of occupation, and both sides had an interest to reach an agreement, which led eventually to, at the end of the day, to the Egyptian-Israeli agreement. I'm depressed because I don't see that scenario repeating itself here under any condition. I see a tribal warfare that is not going to end anytime soon. And certainly, I don't see the United States or anyone else being able to resolve it in the near future.
Yeah, and I share your depression on this, unfortunately, but I think, it's really important for us to, especially highlight the ways, different phases of this conflict have had real political results, right? And I think there is no, real solution to this process that is, purely military or purely a process of subjugation or victory, or however you want to phrase it. At the end of the day, things have to return to politics at some point in some way, and hopefully, that day comes a little bit faster than we all can really see. Since we're talking about international responses, we do have a question in the chat about the prospects of the United Nations becoming active and an important role in perhaps bringing about some sort of ceasefire or aiding Palestinians more than they currently are. Of course, it bears mentioning that for those who aren't aware, I mean, the UN agency that was effectively established to deal with refugees, has been, concerned with the Palestinian refugee issue for over almost 75 years, almost as long as the conflict's been going on, has a major presence in Gaza. And I just read earlier that all of the UN employees, who had been servicing aid for Gazans in the north end of the Gaza Strip have been evacuated to the south of the Strip. Obviously they're in a very, very precarious situation. But I'm curious if either of you have been paying attention to the discussions, in New York, in the Security Council, in the UN of late, and what we're supposed to read out of that, what might come forward. I don't know if either of you have been paying attention to that end.
Well, my role is that the UN is as powerful as the great powers that control it are. I mean, if the great powers in the Security Council are interested in reaching a political solution, they will move to do it, even if the UN doesn't exist. But the UN in itself as an institution has very limited power, except for, providing support to what the great power decide to do. So, peacekeeping forces and so on. It's possible that at some point they might play a role here in Gaza. I don't know, but I won't again wait that anything very significant is going to happen as far as the UN is concerned.
Mm-hmm. Mike, I don't know if you have a view on this. I mean, China is often much more active in the UN than the United States is when it comes to these things. Have you seen anything going on in that space?
No, I mean, China doesn't want to stick its hand into this hornet's nest. And I think the greatest success that the UN has had was the peacekeeping forces, but peacekeepers have to be invited by the parties on the ground. There's no prospect of that happening here. Israel is going to unleash hell on Gaza. I mean, that I would bet a lot on that. The only thing potentially standing in the way is the United States trying to do some diplomacy to encourage the Israelis to maybe go in a more roundabout fashion, a more humanitarian fashion. But I think Israel is dead set on wiping out Hamas and whatever it takes. And Hamas, while is dead set on making sure Israel doesn't exist someday. So I don't see a lot of prospect for the United Nations, which is horribly divided among Russia, China, the United States, doing anything here.
Yeah. I mean, I think that question really does come back around to refugee issues, that are already quite bad within Gaza and within the West Bank and in surrounding countries. If one of the end games here is greater migration out of Gaza into refugee camps, in whether they be in Egypt or somewhere else, I think that's where UN agencies are going to play an even larger role in that kind of issue. We're just about at time here, but I just want to say we want to thank everyone who came here. We have more questions than we had a chance to get to. We are going to be planning more webinars around this topic in the future. We really want to try as best we can to do what we do well here at FPRI, which is to widen the scope, understand the geopolitics of these crises, and really provide the best we can to the best of our ability, knowledge from experts that are close to the situations on the ground and the places they study. So, and this has been a great example of this. Mike, Leon, thank you very, very much for joining us, for your insight. And also thanks to Michael Walsh, who had to leave us earlier, but we really look forward to hearing more from you about how you see this thing playing out. And again, I want to thank our supporters, our donors, our board of trustees for helping make this and all of our programming here at FPRI possible. Stay tuned. Check this video out on YouTube once it arrives there. And hopefully we will see you back again at a future webinar on this topic. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you.